It's a great honor and pleasure to introduce to you the person on this conference who needs least introduction. That's why I prepared a 5-page introduction. The father of MBCT, I would say, of course, together with Zindel Siegel and John Teasdale, Professor MarkWilliams, Emeritus Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Oxford and founder and director until his retirement of the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, known to all of you. I know Mark from the time that nobody had ever heard from mindfulness. But as an experimental and clinical researcher, he was conducting extraordinary research into overgeneralized autobiographic memory in depression and suicide. I remember being invited 20 years ago to give a talk at the Oxford University on family cognitive behavior therapy for child anxiety, and Mark was in the audience, which surprised me, as this was not his research team, and academics are usually too busy to follow talks outside of their research area. I did not know he was there until he approached me afterwards. He gave me a hug, which academics usually don't do. And he said, "What a warm talk." I was surprised because usually academics are asking critical questions during the talk to let know that they are there and know better. And warm was not the qualification I was hoping to get from him. But it did feel as a compliment, though. So what had happened to Mark? Mark was moving into the mindfulness area, and I was unaware of that. Mark's work has relieved the suffering of so many across the world. Those who suffer from depression, including to the point that they want to end their lives. All of us who experience stress embellishing our busy lives. By his scientific and clinical work resulting in the Green Bible for Professionals, the MBCT book. His book on mindfulness and the transformation of despair for working with people at risk for suicide, and his book for the general public, Finding Peace in a Frantic World and the Mindful Way Through Depression. For me, one of the most impressive studies of him is where he compares full MBCT to psychoeducation version of the program, stripping it of all the in-session and homework meditation and finding that on average it works just as good. But not for those with early trauma. They need a meditation. Such rigorous testing of your own program really shows your scientific and critical mind, and is an example to all of us in not getting too attached to our own ideas, our own beliefs, and our own versions of the program. I am deeply grateful for all you have given to clinical science and practice, and personally for being my wise mentor, giving me the freedom and trust to bring your work to the area of childhood psychopathology and supporting me on the way. I remember doing my first mindfulness group ever with the most challenging adolescents, and when in a certain state of despair after the first session, I asked you for advice, you just said, "My experience that when I find a group challenging, I need to meditate a lot." An advice that stayed with me ever since. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy Mark's closing keynote.
Thank you very much indeed for that welcome. And to the conference organisers, it's been an amazing event, I think. You'd agree? Yeah. And what they have done is provided a vehicle for us to meet with each other, to meditate with each other, to learn from each other, And the number of tracks here, of course, one thing we knew when we saw the program was that we were going to miss more than we could go to. That's inevitable. But you could go and walk around the posters any time, and the depth of experience and quality and investigation and curiosity just from the posters, never mind the sessions and the keynotes and the workshops, has been an amazing experience. And I think for many people, actually quite transformative. Now, what I want to do today is, after a little bit of an introduction, mostly address my remarks to those who are beginning in this field. And that allows people who've been here a long time just to sleep peacefully. And nobody will notice. They'll probably think you're meditating. If you're sage and wise enough, that's a benefit. But I want first to, and I address my remarks to those who are teaching, starting out with teaching or using mindfulness in a therapeutic context or in a workplace context. They're starting to teach or beginning to think about teaching. And then people who work in places where they're asked to give taster sessions or to explain what mindfulness is about, which is rather different from teaching mindfulness and has different challenges. And then perhaps some remarks for people who are starting out doing research, investigation, or find themselves in a context where they'd like to know more and they'd like to get a bit of data together. So we'll see if we can address that, if we can. But first, a story. There was once an architect who was asked to design a shopping mall. And she had an award-winning architecture firm that she ran, and she designed this very beautiful shopping mall. And the ribbon was cut, and the mall was opened, and everything was fine. But she decided 6 months later to go by herself, unannounced, to see how it was all going. She took with her an intern, somebody who was there for a week at her firm, learning what the job of an architect was about, somebody from a school or technical college who was just investigating whether they might like this career. So they went up in the lift opened, they stepped out, and what did the architect see? She looked for the space, how the space was working, where the light was coming, where it wasn't coming, whether the people were flowing through the spaces as she had hoped they would flow. Where were the pinch points? Where were the obstacles and blockages which meant that people weren't moving fluently? Maybe she designed a lovely little fountain in the middle, and now there was a sign there saying, "Beware, fountain." So maybe she hadn't designed the obstruction high enough to stop children falling in or people with their iPhones, as we saw in one presentation. So she turned to make a comment to the intern, and the intern wasn't anywhere to be seen. I thought he'd come out of the lift with me, and then she caught sight of him, and he was looking at a large advert for the latest iPhone. And he'd been completely captivated by this and was obviously calculating whether he was earning enough money in his coffee bar job to be able to pay the rent on, or whatever you do now with these iPhones. Do you rent them? No. The contract, that's what it was. And she had to sort of gather him together and start the conversation. The difference between the architect and the intern is this, that the architect was interested in the structure, in the architectural structure of the space and how it was working, how fluently or disfluently it was working, and whether it was working as intended. The intern was captured by the content of something. Now, maybe she saw that and realized that perhaps placing adverts just outside the lift was not helpful. That's a process thought, because he was standing there and people were bumping into him. That was not a good aspect of architecture. But one of the things that we do in a mindfulness approach is we look and invite our participants to look at the architecture of their mind and also how the architecture is working, whether it's flowing fluently as we might say it was designed to do, or whether it is beginning to get disfluent around certain themes, certain contents. It's beginning to block up. And we are once again in our own practice, and the practice that we're inviting people to do is to come back to that architecture perspective, to get a bit of space so we can see the structure and how it's working and the function. And one of the things that we will discover as soon as we start teaching this work, this is still part of the introductory remarks, by the way, I haven't got to new teachers yet, what we'll discover is people are vulnerable. People who come to us for help are vulnerable in all sorts of ways that aren't sometimes clear to them and aren't clear to us. I've just come from a session on preventing harm, where one of the things that came out of that session was you just don't know that some people who have very heavy files because they've been distressed for such a long time might take to a mindfulness course very well. And somebody who's never had any problem at all find themselves getting into problems by coming on a mindfulness course or going on retreat. You just don't know, and therefore how do you put the safety in place? One of the things that we found in our research is that depression, which is what we work on, starts very young. So the average age, or rather the modal age, that's the most common age of onset of serious clinical depression, meeting all the criteria, is between 13 and 15 years of age. And by the age of 18, 50% of people who are ever going to be depressed have already been depressed at least once. And by the age of 24, 75%. Now, by the age of 24, it turns out that 75% of all psychological problems, even serious psychological problems, have already started. Be it psychosis, bipolar disorder, anxiety, serious anxiety. Very few aspects of what is sometimes called mental illness start later than that. There are some, but mostly it's already happened, started to happen. And this means the implications of this is, or for the architecture, as it were, of the mind of people who come for us for help, and of course for us who are offering help, because we're not immune to any of this either, is that often what happens in the workplace or in life is what we see is a reactivation of a previous problem or a previous habit. So if you're doing workplace mindfulness, for example, or you're asked to come in and address people who are on sick leave, then very often that burnout, that anxiety, that depression will be a reactivation. What does that mean? Either I'm or somebody else is hearing voices, so broadcasting. It's always the same voice, isn't it? I've noticed that in airports as well. It's always the same person that calls the flights. And in Britain, in Holland, it's amazing. And they've got that slight downtone in voice. Your flight is about to leave, you know? They never get excited. I think it's a computer voice, actually. But one of the things about this reactivation is when you think about what it was like to be between 13 and 15 years age, what would it like to be a depressed 13 to 15-year-old? Probably there might have been bullying going on. Certainly you would have felt a bit friendless. You might have felt abandoned. And you thought, I could never get through this. You might have also felt suicidal. Funnily enough, half of the people who get depressed never feel suicidal, but once you start feeling suicidal, every time you get depressed, you tend to get suicidal again. It's the most common recurrent feature of depression, apart from just bad mood and lack of interest, which you have to get a diagnosis. Suicidal feelings come back. But if you think about what it was like when you first time, we can understand depression that occurs in your 30s and 40s, and why then what comes back is the same pattern. So in your 30s and 40s, by now you might be a teacher or a psychologist or I don't know, what else, a supervisor in a store or a successful executive, and you get depressed, and you feel bullied and friendless and helpless and abandoned. We can understand that in terms of the patterns that have been coalescing and have been reinforced. And if suicide started, then suicidal feelings again. And I think that's very important to realize that that activation can happen very quickly. So in our research, where we invite people to the lab sometimes and invite people with their consent to see if they can be depressed for a few minutes, to reactivate depression by using sad music. We use Prokofiev, as you know. And people know what's going to happen, and they voluntarily make their mood to go with the music. And if they've never been depressed, it hardly shows any effect at all. But if they've been depressed in the past, then those patterns start to show. And interestingly, if they've been depressed with suicide or suicidal feelings in the past, not only do they get the normal pattern of depression, but their ability to solve problems, even quite simple problems, drops markedly over that 10 minutes. Things like, imagine you'd lost your watch. How would you come back from the shop and you can't find your watch? How would you go about finding it? Or you move into a new neighborhood, you don't have friends, you'd like to have friends. The story finishes with you having friends. How did you get from A to B? And most people can do that. And these people who've been depressed in the past can do it as well, quite well, at the beginning of the experiment. But after 10 minutes of Prokofiev, it's quite markedly how that drops. So what that means is they're carrying around a vulnerability with them, which is not known to them, a latent vulnerability, and often not known to us as well, but it can be very, very quick. And that's why the whole field is moving into considering the balance between the benefits of what we're doing and the adverse, and I'll come back to that later. So let's start with, what do we say then to new teachers, people who are starting out, who perhaps some of you might not have taught a group yet, but you're thinking about it. You might have been trained and you're a bit afraid to teach it. Some of you might be starting out as a therapist and wondering whether to put mindfulness into your therapy, just little bits of mindfulness. Well, if you're a new teacher, welcome. Welcome. There's a lot of fun to be had. It's not all bad. And you will see, I can almost guarantee it, people being transformed in front of your very eyes. And you will need to remember that when you've done one class and you've seen some of these changes, which are amazing, and you've checked that they haven't had any adverse events, but you've seen this, that you don't then assume that you can tell the next class exactly how they're going to feel. It's important to reset to 0 for your second class, and the third class, and the 35th class. Reset to 0. If they're not a very talkative class, then you have to do different things than if they're a very talkative class. If there's one person dominating, you'll have to do different things from if everybody's very quiet. But reset to 0 each time. Especially it's important if there's a sense of, I really need to tell them what happens. Or what relaxation can be, what a great benefit this can be. It's important not to be too cautious. When we started out, we would say, get rid of any expectations. Don't, we're not going to tell you, not going to tell you what's going to happen, we don't know. Just do what it says to do. You don't even have to enjoy it, just do it. Now, that turned out to be good advice, that not necessarily enjoy it bit, but the rest of it we thought, actually, in mature reflection, we were damping down expectations too much. I mean, why would anybody do something for 8 weeks unless there was some possibility that things happen? So I think it is useful to share in a pre-class interview what people notice, but also to say, but everybody is different. It might turn out differently for you or at a different rate. And I think that balance is important. How can we keep the balance there? One of the questions is how to nourish yourself during your teaching. Practice will be important. Practice will be important. You don't actually have to chant the Heart Sutra. For those who were with John Kabat-Zinn's session, he didn't mean that you had to chant the Heart Sutra. He was saying, take this stuff seriously. I don't believe he chants the Heart Sutra, but I have to ask him next time I see him. It's actually about taking seriously the underpinning philosophy and the underpinning psychological science and the wider philosophy that also contributes to this work that people are only just now beginning to discover through books like Pierre Hadot's book, the book on philosophy as a way of life, for example, which talks about the Greeks and particularly the Stoics. Really lovely book that John Peacock, colleague of Stephen and Martine's, put me onto, and I lapped it up. It's very interesting to see how much of this is in other philosophies too, and of course in the monastic tradition within Christianity, within the Greek Orthodox tradition, and even a little bit in Protestantism as well. And there will be more. So yes, chant if that's what you need to do. Read the Gospels if that's what you need to do. But I'm not here to say what you should read. It's a question of keeping in touch with the community, keeping in touch with the community that you find nourishing, and reading, yes, but also practicing and letting that fold into each other. There are times when I don't read anything for a long time. And I look at my bookshelves sometimes and I see them weighed down with very, very worthy books that I'm meaning to read one day. No, that doesn't happen to you? Somehow, even between the time that I order it on Amazon, it comes, my life has moved on. And I'll get to it next week. So, you have to be a bit careful about that, but eventually, you might read it, or somebody will give you a copy for Christmas, and then when there's 2 of them on the shelves, you really get the hint. So find out what way to nourish yourself. Also, if you're teaching classes, we now know, put in safety things. So put in, we routinely ask people to fill in a diary week by week and collected the diary in so we could read it. Now we know there are better things to do, and Willoughby Britton has been telling us of things that she's got on her website that you can download for free, which can help monitor the safety of what you're doing. And that, I think, is a very, very good idea. And some things you can put into the first class as well, just to, given that we don't know who's vulnerable, that you can actually tell people in the first class or perhaps in the pre-class interview. It's up to you, and it'll be different in your different contexts. In fact, Willoughby said something really interesting about some people are very willing, even people who've had trauma history, very willing. So there's willingness there, but sometimes not the capacity. I think that's a really nice distinction, and actually that's true of you too as teacher. You may be willing to do this, but sometimes you won't have the capacity. And if from time to time your own practice dries up and you feel grouchy and you'll get ill, then you may need to talk to your colleagues about withdrawing from teaching for a while and just nourishing yourself rather than ploughing on and thinking, I can meditate through this. You wouldn't, I think, want to say that to one of the people you're caring for. Why would you say it to yourself? So just keeping a balance there too. A couple of questions that new teachers often ask is, can I do bits of mindfulness in my therapeutic practice? And of course, yes is the answer. How much training in mindfulness do I need before I do bits of mindfulness? Usually the next question. Well, now, it's a difficult question. There are therapeutic methods like dialectical behavior therapy, which Marsha Linehan developed, and ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, that Steve Hayes and his colleagues developed, that have mindfulness, as it were, wired into the treatment approach. And if you've been trained in those approaches, you'll know how to use mindfulness. And there are books being written about how to use mindfulness in ordinary therapy. But the important thing is this. The rules for how much mindfulness practice you should have and experience for people who are therapists are naturally of lighter weight than those who are doing whole mindfulness courses, because when you're doing some other therapy, be it psychodynamic therapy or behavior therapy or cognitive therapy or interpersonal therapy, there are other therapeutic processes that are bearing the weight of the change that you hope to see. There are other therapeutic processes that are bearing the weight of the change you hope to see and that the person hopes to see. If you're using only mindfulness, an 8-week program, then mindfulness is bearing almost the whole weight of the change and transformation you hope to see. And so there's more importance, it's much more important for you then, if you're teaching, to have your own practice, to follow the guidelines, to have the community, to have been through a training, and that sort of thing. When you're using therapies that the contract with the person is basically through another mode, then you have to make the judgment when to use, say, a short 3-minute sitting or to advise people to focus on this. It's really helpful, however, to have done some, and actually probably quite a lot of training in mindfulness. The more the better, but more that you know, not just sitting retreats, but you know the aims and intentions of that particular practice in the context in which you want to use it. Somebody came to me once and said, I'm beginning to use the breath in my PTSD work. And he wasn't a mindfulness teacher. And it was really good on the first person. The second one said, I'm having a panic attack. I'm having a panic attack. What should I have done? What would you say? I mean, there's nothing to say, is there? Actually, apart from, well, what do you know about what the breath is doing? Because the point is that some people find it very difficult to focus on the breath, especially if they've got tendency to panic attacks. But there are other anchor points. If the purpose of the breath is to anchor our attention, then there are other anchor points. There's the feet, there's the hands. Often the breath at the nostrils is slightly easier for people than the breath in the tummy or the chest. There's the sounds, there's opening eyes, so anchor points are important, but it doesn't have to be one anchor point. And I think that's the sort of the thing you get from training and being with colleagues and having colleagues to talk to. So I was quite sad that he was quite, in a sense, lonely and isolated, trying these things out because he's heard they were good. And I don't blame him for that, but there's a sense of needing to keep in touch with the community and the aims and intentions of the practice. Some teachers can also ask, well, can I adapt the 8-week program? Well, of course you've got to adapt the 8-week program. Why wouldn't you adapt the 8-week program? The question is, do we understand enough about what John calls the DNA of the program to be able to adapt it and move to, so shorter sessions, longer sessions, shorter meditation, longer meditation, more sessions, less sessions, low dose, high dose, well, you know. As John said yesterday, to a lovely question about, how do we choose whether we go sort of broad and sort of thin or narrow and deep, because there's so many people want this. And he said, we don't need to make that distinction because you never know what even a so-called narrow and shallow, appears shallow, how people can meet even one raisin given in a taster session and suddenly it transforms their life. They just are in a mode in which they need, or something has been shown them of what they're missing just from tasting one raisin. You don't even need a second raisin for that to happen. And that's amazing. So you can adapt the program, and it's being adapted, and that's great. Fabrizio Di Donna has a book coming out on MBCT for OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. There's work on cancer patients, taking MBSR into cancer, taking MBCT into cancer patients, like Trish has done. There's work on MBSR for social phobia. There's all sorts of ways in which we have to adapt. Now, how do we do the adaptation? We look carefully at what is causing and maintaining the distress in the population who are coming to seek our help. What's causing and then maintaining the distress? And one of the best examples of adapting an MBSR program is the work on mindfulness-based childbirth and parenting. If you don't know Nancy's book, which she calls Daisy, because it's got a little daisy on the front, on mindful birthing, then read it even if you aren't expecting a baby, as an example of adapting a program to meet the needs of people who are sometimes terrified of what is happening to them, if this is the first time it's happening to them. And not just the mum, but the partner as well, terrified by this new experience of parenting. Or how do you parent another child when you've already got a child? And for example, the whiteboard, the explanation of what pain is and isn't, what can be expected, what's actually going on to what has been typically called contraction, which is actually properly spoken of, an opening. And how can people learn to bear intense sensations? So she has ice practice, as you probably know, in which you get to hold, you and the partner, get to hold ice for 1 minute at a time, the length of the contraction, and trying out different meditations to see how one can work with it. And it'll be different for different people. What actually, not that at the end you'll go, oh, this is really nice ice. No. But there's usually one meditation where you don't feel like throwing it away at the end of a minute, and that's the one. And at the end of that practice, then I know some women have said, you know what, I don't think I'll have a cesarean after all. And that's amazing. And now there's data from this very place actually showing that that's not just one or two, that actually, when the data is analysed and it's still being analysed, it looks like it's going to emerge that is actually happens across if you do a randomised controlled trial as well. And my daughter's a midwife and teaches mindfulness to just this group, and she comes back with extraordinary stories, sometimes from the women, sometimes from their partners, but amazing. There too, where is the balance between the benefit and the harm? But still, so far, it's been transformative. And what I mean to say, it's an example of adapting MBSR, because Nancy's experience was people would come to MBSR and their couples, but they would tend to leave. What's this do to me? You know, it's all very good, but, you know, what's the relevance? But when she adapted it, hardly anybody leaves. After the ice practice, they don't leave. This is serious stuff. I'm staying. And that's extraordinary. So yes, you can adapt it. We've heard in this conference, you've seen posters on adaptation, for pain, for trauma, for older people, for people with dementia, for parents, for workplace. Where's the DNA? What's maintaining the suffering? Adapt. And then you'll know. You'll know. So, I'm going to move on in a moment to talking about people who are moving into just explaining mindfulness to people, but why don't we take a breathing space right now? And if you want to do this standing up, that might be, if that's what your body needs, then just allow yourself to stand. Allow yourself to stand. Give yourself permission to stand. And you can stretch if you like as well. You can put one arm up in the air or two arms up in the air, and again, do whatever your body needs. And whether you're sitting or standing, you can probably feel your feet on the floor. And if it feels comfortable to you, letting your eyes close or just lowering your gaze. And in this way, stepping out of automatic pilot and dropping in to stillness. And the first step, noticing what the weather pattern is like in mind and body right now. Maybe even noticing whether we're liking or disliking what's here. Whether there's a feeling tone. And seeing if it's possible simply to recognize and acknowledge what's already here. And then at a certain point, step 2, gathering our attention and placing it on the breath, or the feet, or the hands. And then step 3, expanding to the body as a whole, sitting or standing here. Coming home to the body. And maybe moving fingers and toes, allowing your eyes to open if they've been closed. Taking in the room again. Thank you. Now, not all of us are going to be teaching mindfulness, but often, because people will know that you've been to this conference, you may be invited to give a lecture on mindfulness. Especially if you work in an academic context or a clinical context, or if somebody's paid for you to come, they'll want their money's worth. Now you can give us a talk and you won't be able to refuse. So how do you introduce mindfulness to a group of people who may not be all that interested? That's often worth bearing in mind. People who work in the workplace know that quite often they have a conscript audience. They're people who aren't necessarily wanting to be there, but the boss has told them to be there. Or school children in a class. They don't have much choice. And that's where you find people in those contexts actually sometimes explaining mindfulness in terms not of transformation and wonderful things, not even relaxation, but starting with some basic psychological science. You might try to explain, for example, why it is we get upset about things, but we don't switch off perhaps as readily as gazelles do on the African savannah. You know, they switch on, switch off. Or we might explain to busy executives why multitasking can sometimes be exhausting. And one very good way, which I actually got from a colleague in the Netherlands here, of explaining how 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Is that back on? Okay. Hey, wouldn't it be nice if we had a system where we could just reboot like that? Now, perhaps not. Anyway, Alexa, reboot. So in multitasking turns out to not be multitasking. You know that? It's actually mostly multi-switching. When you have a global workspace in the head, let's say, and you can multitask most effectively when you've overlearned one task, and then you can do it in parallel with another task. So, for example, if you are driving a car, you can change gear and talk to your partner, usually. When you started learning with a stick shift in a car, was that possible? No. In fact, do you still remember the screams when you looked down to try to find the gear stick? And you were sort of, I learned to drive, I have to say, and some of you already know this, on my mother's Minor 1000 car, little bubbly car, with a split screen at the front, and a gear shift that was so long, it emerged from the floor somewhere there and ended in a Bakelite knob somewhere up here, but the writing had long been rubbed off the Bakelite knob, and even before you pressed the clutch, it did this without you having to do anything to the car or to the clutch. So when you put the foot on the clutch, you had to then spend a long time finding the gear. It's very, very sort of disabling, and many screams. But then, a few months later, now it's interesting that my wife was once a research assistant on a project where she sat in the back of a car, this was at Cambridge, and she had to see or try to measure how much executive capacity or global workspace people had left as they were driving around Cambridge. Yeah, exactly. And what she was doing was measuring their global capacity using random letter generation. It's actually very difficult to generate letters randomly, or even numbers randomly for that matter, unless you really focus. It really wraps up all your attention. And if you don't focus, then the letters tend to come out UNHCR, IRA, ICM, all these sort of little, or your initials, and you lose the randomness. And actually the most common thing is ABCDE, yeah? And that's where you notice that the randomness has been lost. And some people could do this quite well. Changing gear was no problem. The random letters kept coming. But at an intersection, people would get very non-random or even stop altogether. And if they didn't stop, they were very dangerous at the intersection because they couldn't see what was coming. So you can do some things, but not others. And the whole purpose of doing a random task and driving is that some things can't share the workspace. It's got to be one or the other. So when we think we're doing multitasking, it's very often multi-switching. And it takes more effort to do that. And so the best way of illustrating this, as I say, I got from a colleague in the Netherlands, was this. If you think of, in your own country, you probably learned little nursery rhymes or poems when you were a child. Now think of the first two lines of your favorite, or the most commonly cited. Just think of it in your head. Now count up how many words it is, the first two lines of your nursery rhyme. Okay, so just shout out, how many words have you got? 15, 11, 14, 10, 4. That sounds like a koan. It's a very advanced nursery rhyme. Absolutely. So, good. So just bear in mind how many. Now, I want you just to read in your mind the first two lines of your nursery rhyme as quickly as you can. The first two lines of your nursery, as quickly as you can. Just put your hand up when you've finished. Yeah, okay. So most of that was done in about 3 seconds, no problem. Okay, now I want you to, as fast as you can, just count up to the number of words there was. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that sort of thing. As fast, in your own language, as fast as you can, and put your hand up when you're finished, starting now. Yeah, so 50% finished in about 4 seconds. Okay, so you can count the number of, and you can do the nursery rhyme 3 seconds, 4 seconds. So in 7 seconds, you can do both sequentially. Now, I want you in your own mind to go first word 1, second word 2. So mine was Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. So it's Jack 1 and 2, Jill 3, went 4. All right? Okay, so just when you're ready, start and then put your hand up when you finish, starting now. Pretty good. We're not to 50% yet. Keep coming. Absolutely. You see what I mean? Yeah, I mean, probably about 15, 20 seconds, maybe. So there's the difference between 7 seconds and at pretty much double, sometimes even treble. And you can actually quantify, you can just divide the number of words and numbers you're having into the extra time it took. So that would tell you the switching cost each time you were switching. The switching cost each time you were switching. And why it's difficult is because you have to hold in mind where you were, but on both channels, and then come back and then hold that in mind. And also there's something called inhibition of return in the mind, which means that when you attend to one thing, and then move away from it, there's an inhibitory tag there saying, don't go back. Otherwise, we'd never be able to search for people in a crowd, yeah? Unless you actually, when you're checking for people, you'd inhibited the ones you'd already looked for, you'd keep going back to the same loop, yeah? Or an animal foraging, once it's decided that's no good, it's got to move on and forage elsewhere. So you've got to have some inhibition of return. So it's a very good psychological principle. We have that. The architect needs to build that into the model, but it has consequences. And one of the consequences is that if you try to switch too much, it takes effort and it takes time. The problem is that when we're doing a difficult document and an email comes in, nobody's standing behind us to say, are you going to switch? Oh, you switched. Okay, you answer the email, send it off. You can get rid of one email. It's easy to get rid of one email. Yeah? And back to your document. Oh, ping, that's the answer to the one you just replied to. Okay, so already you've given yourself 2 events when there really was only 1 event if you just waited. Okay, so get rid of that one. Then a really important email comes in. So you've got to answer that one. Despite your best efforts, you've got to answer that one, so you think. So you're back to your document. Nobody calculates for you the equivalent of what we've just done. Nobody says, you know what? If you kept all your emails until the end, it would take 5 minutes, but actually it's taking you 10 minutes. And if you just finished that document, it would take you 40 minutes, but it's actually taking you 2 hours. And at the end of that 2 hours, you know what's going to happen? You're going to press delete instead of save. And for those who are doing PhDs, be careful. When somebody says downstairs or something, would you like a cup of coffee or your dinner's ready or something like that, if you have somebody who says lovely things like that, just notice the tendency, no, I'm just finishing this. I'll be there in a moment. Yeah? No, don't interrupt me now. Yeah. If only we had somebody standing. But we don't, so we have to do this for ourselves, I'm afraid. But you can do that with executives or with patients or in the workplace, and somehow people get it. In a way they won't if you say, now, mindfulness is a wonderful, transformative thing, and it'll help you with your stress. And everybody's stressed these days, aren't they? And people just blank out. Because how many times have we seen the data on stress? And we all say, oh, it's terrible. But how many times do we keep actually just interrupting ourselves? I mean, This is a quote from Rumi. "I must have been incredibly simple or drunk or insane to sneak into my own house and steal money." Next line, "to climb over the fence and take my own vegetables." And he didn't have email. But he gets it, yeah? How we disturb ourselves, how we disturb our peace in ways that are too numerous to mention. So for those of you who are beginning teaching other people, it's useful to have these, gazelle-type experiences, or the experiments, or the mouse and the maze. They're in all the books. The mouse and the maze experiment, or the multitasking experiment. So now, lastly then, for new researchers, welcome. Research is hard, but also it's lovely. When people talk about meditation as a discipline is hard, research as a discipline is hard too. There are rules, and you are regularly exposing yourself in a way that many, many other fields don't, to very, very personal criticism. You do research, you send off papers, and unless you're very lucky, some months later, when you're not expecting it, you'll get an email with long, long description of why they're not going to publish your data. And that happens to all of us. Thank you. That happens to all of us. So if you're starting out on a PhD or a new research, then get yourself great supervisors, and second supervisors, a great supervisory team. Offer to if you are preparing, offer to analyze somebody else's data. Usually, researchers have lots of unanalyzed data they haven't got to. And it's a really good way of getting to know programs, research, statistical programs, actually analyzing other people's data, with their permission, of course, to follow up questions that they haven't had time to answer. But many of you may be in a clinical context in which you're not doing a PhD, or you might be doing a master's, but you just want to see whether your patients are getting better. So you want to use some task. And although it may be difficult to publish your data, you won't need to, because you want to know. First of all, you want to know if you're not doing harm. And it's really good to perhaps, if you've got people going through a program, to do some simple audit type measures. You can do them week by week. So what are the sort of things that you could look at with just pre and post designs? Well, what predicts whether people do homework or not? We don't know, I don't think. What would you say? Just shout out. What do you think? Is it personality? Is it enthusiasm? What do you think, actually, we could measure beforehand that would predict whether people would do homework or not? Conscientiousness, okay, one of the big five. Sorry? Nothing, okay. Sounds like Harold's looked at it. Yes? Parents. Yeah. Anxiety, stress level, yeah. So we just really want that. Yeah. Expectations. Big suffering. So, yeah. So you could assess that. Whether it's reinforcing, absolutely. So one of the interesting things there is you can measure stuff beforehand. Here's all these hypotheses you've got. So the group have given you some ideas from personality, like conscientiousness or openness to experience. Another of the personality type variables, or expectations. John Teasdale, in his early days of cognitive therapy, just gave people a little booklet explaining cognitive therapy. When people came back, he said, "What do you think of it?" And some people said, "Oh, this is me exactly." Or some people said, "Oh, I don't know, I think I've got a biological depression, I'm not so sure." And he got independent raters to rate the comments from +3 to -3. That predicted as high as anything whether people's outcome after 12 weeks of cognitive therapy. Giving people a bit of information and asking them, "What do you think? Does this like that sort of thing to do?" Well, I don't know whether anybody's done that for mindfulness, but it's relatively easy to do if you're just having patients go through your clinic. You can, as I say, you can look for harm. You can do week by week just to see if it's gradual improvement in your client group or whether it's actually sudden change at some point. You could test new cognitive tasks. Often if there are people, biologists around who have a new biomarker, then with a pre-post design, they might actually invite, well, can you invite any of your people to join in our research, and we'll see whether this biomarker changes over time. Because all research needs to start with that sort of pre and post type proof of principle. And if you want a good example, look at Nirb Singh's. He's the editor of Mindfulness, so you can find him anywhere if you can get access to the journal. He's got a paper in Frontiers of Psychology. It's open access. You can look at it, I was going to say now, but later, about a 7-day intensive mindfulness-based positive behaviors for staff who are looking after very challenging learning disabled adults. And they were able to look at the 7-day and to monitor from independent reports of how many restraints were used in that setting, both before and after, and how many staff got injured, both before and after, in the 6 months before, period before, period after, and how many patients got injured. And there you see the graphs. And I mean, he may go on to do a randomized controlled trial, but when you look at the graphs, his managers won't be saying, oh, I think I need an RCT to see if this is right. Because one of the lines, I think, went down from 40 episodes to 2 episodes in this certain standard period. I commend that paper to you. And that's just a pre-post design. So we're going to wind up in a moment, but I just want in my closing remarks just to go back to that architect and to think of architecture on looking at the architecture, the form and function of the mind, to notice where we get drawn in, what calls and shouts out for our experience, and also for that of our patients, clients, those people who come for us for help. And if you're starting out, well, not only welcome, but good luck. And all the older people who have been doing this for years, this is their chance now to wake up. And then you can ask them how they managed over all those years. So thank you to Susan, to Anna, to Marlois, all the people have contributed to this amazing event. Thank you.